Bueno. Buenos días. ¿Cómo están todos? Y sé que el almuerzo que está casi listo. Te prometo que no les voy a aburrir. Mira, antes que todo no puedo empezar sin agradecer a mi querido amigo congresista Robert Pittenger. He participado en varios de estos foros. Muchos de ustedes ya he podido conocerlos, sino en 2021, cuando estuvimos aquí mismo en el Parliamentary en Panamá, o en otros foros, en Argentina, en Guatemala, en Hungría, en Rumania. Muchos de ustedes los puedo llamar amigos gracias a los esfuerzos del congresista Pittenger. También quiero agradecer a un hombre muy especial. Yo creo que este foro no se hubiera podido llevar a cabo sin nuestro querido amigo Alejo Campos y todo lo que están haciendo en Crime Stoppers. Realmente es una innovación en el mundo en la lucha contra el crimen organizado. Gracias por todo lo que haces, Alejo. Mira, antes que empiezo a mezclar y hacer errores de mi español, y yo sé que tengo una cara de boliviano, mis padres son de Bolivia, pero yo nací en Estados Unidos, entonces tengo un español que es estilo boligringo. Entonces, antes que empiezo a hacer errores, voy a cambiar a inglés. Y lo siento para los que tienen que usar la traducción, pero este es el momento que se tienen que poseer porque voy a cambiar a inglés. So I'm going to give my presentation in English, and I think from what Selena was saying, I'm going to attempt to basically take the conversation a little bit towards the strategic level. You know, transnational organized crime is often thought of as a very transactional issue. It's thought of as an issue that's mostly dealt with in law enforcement, but also, obviously in many cases, also dealt with the military. But I think in today's global security environment, and Selena was hitting on a lot of these points, as was other speakers throughout the last day and a half, is we're starting to see transnational organized crime being operationalized in ways we would have never thought was imaginable in years past. Part of that is due to technology, but most of that is actually due to new methods of warfare that are actually old ways of warfare that are being utilized by adversarial nation states. But let me begin by giving you, I think, a key question to encapsulate a lot of what we've been discussing over the last 2 days. And this is a question that I ask a lot of individuals, much like yourselves, parliamentarians, policymakers, ministers, flag officers, and is what makes an illicit activity illicit? I say in Spanish too. ¿Qué hace que una actividad ilícita sea ilícito? So cuando te pones a pensar, I'm sorry, I'm going to go English. When you start to think about what makes an illicit activity illicit, the number one response that I get is the law. But then you go into a rabbit hole of what makes a law. And it's not really the answer I'm looking for. The answer to what makes an illicit activity illicit is, it's on the map, it's borders. Because more than lines on a map, borders provide not just a legal framework from one country to another, but they provide an identity of a nation state that drives its culture. And so when we talk about transnational organized crime, the operative word there is transnational. It tends to bleed through borders, and by extension, since to start to change the culture of multiple societies. So let me take you to perhaps the most dangerous border in the Western Hemisphere. Here back in the United States, particularly in Washington, we have a lot of conversations about border security because of the crisis that's happening on the U.S. southern border. And I often remind my fellow experts and policymakers in Washington that what we're experiencing on the U.S. southern border is an extension, if not a symptom, of multiple border crises that we're facing all throughout Latin America. So let me take you to what I would describe as probably the worst or the most vulnerable border in the Western Hemisphere, and that's the border between Colombia and Venezuela. So for a little bit of context, I'm sure many of you in the audience know this already, but just for a little bit of context, Venezuela is the most severe humanitarian crisis that we have ever seen in Latin America's history. We've had a lot of humanitarian crises in the region, natural disasters, we've even had wars, but we've never seen something at the magnitude of what's happening today in Venezuela. It has catalyzed the largest migrant and refugee outflows in the world, having surpassed Syria last year, and is larger than Ukraine, 2 active war zones. We're talking about upwards of 7.2 million Venezuelans have left that country since 2014. That's approximately 10% of its population is no longer in Venezuela, is scattered throughout Latin America and the world. So when I went to visit the Colombia-Venezuela border, and I visited many parts of the border, I began to see a lot of what everybody's been seeing on the news, which is the humanitarian crisis. Obviously, I saw the mass migration. I also saw the conflict among illicit actors, mainly major transnational criminal organizations, most notably the dissidents of the FARC and the ELN. In fact, in April of 2021, this really came to a heat when these different transnational criminal groups began to fight one another to gain territorial control over the cross-border drug trade. It got very violent and very deadly. In fact, that's a picture of me on the Arauca River. Arauca River is the river that on the border of the Arauca province on Colombia, in the Apure province on Venezuela. In fact, we had to cut that patrol short. I was accompanying the Colombian Marines because they found a dead body inside the water laced with explosives. So this is a day-to-day occurrence of what's happening on the Colombian and Venezuelan border. But what I really saw, and I was able to visit this like 2 or 3 times over the last couple of years, and the last visit I took was in April of 2022. And what I really saw when I went to the Colombia-Venezuelan border was I saw Russian radar systems, the P-18 mobile radar in particular, sucking up the communications of the Colombian military. I saw Iranian-made surveillance drones doing low-level overflights over Colombian airspace. I saw Chinese satellites being managed out of a PLA satellite tracking facility in a military base in the center of Venezuela. What I saw great power competition manifesting itself within a hotbed of transnational organized crime on the Colombia-Venezuelan border. What may appear to be random acts of violence, spontaneous eruptions of conflict, an array of illicit activity, what may be just very random occurrences, you can start to see a process of where humanitarian crisis leads to mass migration, leads to conflict among illicit actors, which leads to then great power competition on your border. When it gets to that point, when your border gets to that point, in the capacity of the border security officials, whether it's military or law enforcement that are responsible for protecting your sovereign nation state, you begin to lose your border. And by extension, you begin to weaken your democracy. This is deliberate. This is not by accident, it's by design. So let me now jump into a case study that I want to present to you guys. And I think this is an actor that hasn't been, a threat actor that hasn't been mentioned up until this point. But I think being here, we're in Latin America, I think it's very worthwhile mentioning. Another border that you often hear about when you talk about border issues in the Western Hemisphere is the tri-border area in the south of South America. This is the intersection of Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. And unfortunately, it's a very great area, tourist destination with the Iguazu Falls, but unfortunately, we also tend to hear about the presence of an array of transnational criminal organizations. Among them is Hezbollah. So in the United States, and I think in the world, we recognize Hezbollah for many things. So they are a political party in Lebanon. They also have a media station in Lebanon. They're also recognized as a foreign terrorist organization by more than 60 countries throughout the world, including the United States since 1997, and as of 2019, at least 5 countries from Latin America. But Hezbollah is also looked at as a transnational criminal organization. In fact, in 2018, the Department of Justice published a list of what they considered to be at the time the top 5 transnational criminal organizations in the world. Now, some of the people that you would expect, some of the groups that you would expect were on that list, such as Mexican drug trafficking organizations, the infamous gang or super gang from El Salvador, MS-13, was also on that list. But Hezbollah also appeared on that list, because Hezbollah, beyond their work and what they've done inside Lebanon, and beyond their terrorist actions that they've done throughout the world, including in Latin America in the 1990s, they're also heavily involved in drug trafficking and money laundering. In fact, a colleague of mine in Washington had once called them the Federal Express or the Western Union for major drug trafficking cartels in Latin America, because they have a major banking network that extends throughout the world. When we go to the tri-border area, what we see is a model that is being now replicated in other parts of the region. What you see is a model where you have 3 different cities with 3 different languages using 3 different currencies, but very in a tight geographic space. And what you see is the ability to use matching corporate registries. So you have corporate registries in one city, you set up another company in the other city, different jurisdiction, but has a matching corporate record. You see multiple nationalities, many times dual nationalities, the same individual with multiple passports, and you see a free trade zone. When you combine those 3 things, and none of those are bad in and of themselves, but when you combine those 3 things, they can be exploited by illicit actors. And this is how Hezbollah has been able to create a robust trade-based money laundering scheme out of the tri-border area. That has now moved to other parts of Latin America, most notably Venezuela. That's a picture of a 2020 report I wrote for the Atlantic Council, another think tank in Washington, D.C., where we put forth data about how Hezbollah operates in Venezuela. Now, the kicker here is some of those individuals you see on the slide. So are they Hezbollah? Are they not Hezbollah? So this has been a big discussion inside the intelligence community. Unfortunately, Hezbollah does not carry business cards, so it's hard to know who exactly is a operative member of Hezbollah. But what we know is that they're prominent members of their communities, and they're individuals that are supporters or sympathetic to Hezbollah, meaning that's the term that we use now is Hezbollah support networks or Hezbollah sympathizers. And what we've seen is in Venezuela, they have essentially started to grab specific industries and get involved in robust trade-based money laundering. But there's an aspect of this that needs to be added, because the tri-border that we see among these 3 cities in South America is extending to Central America through here. The new maritime tri-border, it's not a physical tri-border, it's a water tri-border, is between the city of Punto Fijo, Venezuela, Maicao, Colombia, and Colón, Panama. Now, my friend Michael Chen was here earlier today, and he told you that does not have to stay this way, and I agree with him. There's a lot of honest and hardworking businessmen, especially in the Lebanese communities, in all 3 of these cities, especially in Colón, Panama. But Hezbollah has a tendency and a habit of penetrating Lebanese communities like any mafia has done in the past, like the Irish mob in its day, the Italian mafia, as you've seen in Sopranos, in the movies. Well, mafias tend to work through the diaspora. And what they have done is they have replicated the model that they use in the south of South America, in the tri-border area, and taken it to a new tri-border, a maritime tri-border, with a distinct advantage. It still has the dual nationalities or multiple nationalities. It still has the 3 different currencies. So it has the ability to do exchange, manipulate currency exchange, but it has 2 added advantages. One is the obvious, it's on the water, but the second is it now has a hub in a dollarized country. And that, for money laundering purposes, and Selena could give a whole class on this, is a very advantageous for transnational organized crime. Now let me jump into what this is working on, because this convergence of terrorist organizations, criminal organizations, and then operating spaces within countries that aren't not just stopping this, but in some sense incentivizing it, such as Venezuela, is presenting problems that we haven't seen in the past. It's making transnational organized crime much greater. So I'm going to start to talk to you about an emerging threat within transnational organized crime, and one that's specific to an industry that's very vulnerable at this point. It's the agriculture industry. Not sure if you guys are involved in agriculture industry, but as policymakers, I'm sure you're overseeing. This is a video, I'm gonna play the video, hopefully it works, and just listen to what they're talking about. This is a program that was launched in 2020 in Venezuela within the agriculture industry of that country.
Cumplimiento del decreto que usted lanzó, Venezuela libre de aftosa y esa libertad de exportación que tenemos por haber cumplido todos los protocolos se materializa el día de hoy, después de 120 años, compañero presidente. La última exportación que se hizo desde Venezuela fue hace 120 años y se hizo de 2 ganaderías del estado Guárico para la hermana República de Cuba en ese entonces, 1900. Yo quisiera que el doctor Humire nos dijera esto porque es parte de la activación del vértice de exportación de la gran misión Agro-Venezuela.
I'm driving the translators crazy with this multiplying. What he was saying, for those that don't speak Spanish, what he was saying is essentially they're talking about this new international trade program that they launched in Venezuela in 2020 to send cattle, livestock from Venezuela to the Middle East, to export livestock to the Middle East, and obviously in exchange for foreign investment. Okay, so we're all for free trade, nothing wrong with that. However, let's put this into some context. Venezuela is actually, as we mentioned earlier, is one of the 2 countries that, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United States, is one of the 2 countries that experiences famine, which is severe food insecurity. Right? Haiti is the other one. It's a country that has 9.3 million of its people considered severely malnourished. So in a country that is struggling to have food security, they're sending cattle to the Middle East. Okay. Well, let's see how that program has done. This is a graph, this is a slide that'll show you 7 ships from different countries that were part of this program that were exporting the cattle from Venezuela to different countries in the Middle East, in this case 4 countries, Iraq, Egypt, Spain actually, and I'm missing a 3rd country. But anyways, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, and Spain. Pay attention to 2 things that are on this slide. I'll actually highlight them for you. The first is there was an interagency task force developed in Venezuela to implement this program. Among the different agencies, there was actually 6 agencies that were responsible for overseeing this program. Among those 6 agencies was the National Guard of Venezuela and the Anti-Drug Agency. Okay, that makes sense. You want to protect those shipments. Then there was this ship, this one ship that with the flag carrier of Togo from Africa that made some shipments to, I believe it was Egypt in 2021 to send some of this livestock and these cattle to that country. Less than a month ago, on January 28th of 2023, that ship, the Spiridon, and it has the same IMO number, the same flag carrier, was seized, was detained and seized in territorial waters of Spain for carrying 4,500 kilos of cocaine. 4,500 kilos of cocaine. That takes mules to a whole nother level. If you do the street value, the conversion, that's upwards of $180 to $300 million worth of cocaine. And that's one ship, that's one shipment. There was multiple shipments, there were 7 ships just in half of 2021. You start to aggregate these numbers, and you don't talk about the millions, you talk about the billions. And when you start talking about the billions, you're talking about GDP level numbers. And that's what essentially we're seeing here. That's what happens when the convergence starts to take place, not just among illicit actors, but starts to take place with malign authoritarian regimes. So let's take a quick look to wrap this up at what's happening inside Venezuela. And this is the so what. This is the takeaway for all you that are looking throughout the region, because this is not just about Venezuela. We know that Venezuela's economy has contracted, right? Its economy has receded 60% over the last 8 years, meaning they've lost 60% of their GDP over the last 8 years. And when we think of Venezuela, most of us think of a petrostate, an oil-producing country, and it largely still is, but not as much as it once was. Because when the GDP of Venezuela goes from what it used to be, which was over 100 billion, to now 43 billion and dropping, Venezuela is no longer just a petrostate, it's more moving in the direction of an agro-state. Its GDP, Venezuela's GDP today is what it was in 1950, before Venezuela began to produce massive amounts of petroleum. So how does this apply? Because in every aspect of transnational organized crime, it operates within an ecosystem. And that ecosystem is illicit economies. And in society, at any given time, in all of your countries, there exists both the formal economy, the informal economy, and at the extent of that is the illicit economy. This always exists in the United States and everywhere. The key is to be able to remove the barriers of entry, remove the obstacles so that the formal enterprise can grow, to outpace the informal enterprise, and then eventually to diminish the illicit enterprise. But when you do not do that, or when you fail to do that, it doesn't mean that consumption stops. It doesn't mean that the scales of economy just start to dissipate or disappear. The formal economy will shrink, but the illicit economy will thrive. And that's when transnational organized crime begins to take over. Today, territorial control defines power more than any form of democratic governance. And transnational organized crime is the best method, is the best tool, is the best weapon for malign authoritarian regimes such as Venezuela, such as China, such as Russia, such as Iran, to gain more power. Now I'm getting the high sign that I have to stop, so I'm going to end with one thing, because, and I was planning to tell you a little bit more about another element of transnational organized crime that's emerging into this threat matrix, which is irregular, underreported, and unregulated fishing. This is something that you really have to pay attention to in terms of what Minister Pino was talking about. The maritime domain is starting to become very contested by transnational criminal activities, and this is among all of them. And I will leave you with this one slide. I'm not going to be able to explain it, but I did want to show it, which is that Latin America and the Caribbean is now entering, in what Selena was saying, into this great competition that we're seeing among global powers. But the difference is that the other global powers that are throughout the world, be it Russia, be it China, and I would even include Iran, considering their alignments, is now beginning to weaponize transnational organized crime as a way to gain more territorial control and diminish that geographic advantage that the United States and Latin America has had over time. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope to continue the conversation.